So we have Mike Trilli with us next.
Yeah, let's kind of turn the chapter from wearables and compliance and employer law to the ever-changing, fast-growing, moving target of private exchanges and where private exchanges are. And joining us on the program today is Mike Trilli with the Aite Group out of Boston. Mike, good morning to you.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you?
We're great. Great to have you on the program. Appreciate you joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Yeah, give our audience a little bit of background on the Aite Group, and then we'll get into your current report.
Oh, absolutely. So Aite Group is a research and advisory firm, and we're based out of Boston. And we focus on financial services, and we really cut across three lines of the industry, if you will: investment in securities, banking, and insurance. And I'm the senior healthcare analyst that forms part of our insurance, and we also have a property and casualty and life insurance practice. And so we're a primary research firm, and as a senior analyst in the health insurance practice, I cover private exchanges, healthcare payments, and healthcare fraud, among a couple other areas. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit about the exchange space today.
Yeah, and you have recently come out with a new report, U.S. Private Exchanges Ready for Liftoff. I mean, let's talk about that. What are some of the highlights of this report?
This is really an interesting report. So if I just take a step back for a second,
sure.
Aite Group has been covering the private exchange space since 2012. And the way we kind of go about and do our research is, we tackle end users, which in the private exchange space are the employers or the buyers, if you will. And, then we also look at the vendors. And in this particular report, I opened it up a little bit more and looked at the value chain. So when I think of private exchanges, you think of the technology vendors, you think of what I call the product suppliers, so the health plans, the ancillary carriers, and so forth. Then we have the sales channel. So it was really an aggregate of, those perspectives in terms of really focusing on how they go to market and what are the implications of those go-to-market strategies. And I think really one of the key takeaways that came out of the research was looking to, kind of calibrate what the enrollment projections may be. And, given this is, one of the key takeaways, given it's an early stage market, it is characterized obviously as a strong and growth market. And, one of the key findings that I had is, as we look through 2020, we're talking about a compounded annual growth rate of about 41%. And I think it's easy to characterize that and say the current pace of adoption may be a little bit slower than many expected. But, as we kind of think about, some of the market factors out there, as we look into kind of the 2016 enrollment, we're really going to start seeing a very strong trajectory and, almost tripling, if you will, by 2020 to reach just under 25 million enrollees. So I think that's really a key takeaway is, I think expectations are very high. I think we have a lot of companies doing a lot of great things out there, and we're seeing participation rate across that product group and across the broker or the sales channel. And I think we're really going to start seeing the fruits of those efforts over the next 4 years.
Yeah, I think we saw kind of a pause this year, or when I was leading kind of a panel discussion at West, I think what we talked about was everyone kind of took a deep breath this year, and I think that's understandable. I mean, from both, employers and the sales distribution channels to the vendors themselves, I think it was probably time for us to take a deep breath. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I would. I mean, I think and by the way, I think your conference, you guys did a fantastic job. I think the consistency and the breadth of perspectives, just about what's going on in the private exchange space, I think the broader consumerism was great. But I think if we look back at what's going on in the exchange market, I think there is a little bit of an inflection point. And, if I was to kind of look at this market, I mean, I think certainly the key accelerator, right, is the Cadillac Tax. Mm-hmm. I'll call that the elephant in the room, and at least in my home office, that elephant's sitting right next to me, right? But I think you have that regulatory uncertainty, if you will, and that but you put that aside for a moment, and I think you're really, that tax is creating a window of opportunity. And I think that opportunity, as maybe you just pointed out, really starts in 2016, because there's no question a lot of employers are kicking the tires on private exchanges, but I think it's a very highly strategic decision, and I think what we're seeing is them sorting through that and working with their sales partners to come up with the best solution for them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Mike. There are some that would say the Cadillac tax is going to be an impediment to exchange growth because employers are going to be too busy trying to wrestle with the Cadillac tax. What's your perspective on that?
I think it could. If you look at my model, it's actually kind of interesting because, there's certainly growth and a lead up into, 16 and 17, right? But I think you're right on point. And one of the key points I made in the research is, kind of going back to expectations. As we look at 2019 and 20, that may be the big boom, right? So as employers, that's a pretty deep exercise to understand, what are the implications, right, of that tax? But I think there's another implication there and says, do I mind paying that tax, right? We can look around other industries, whether that's, sports industries, NFL. There are some companies out there willing to pay, a tax. So just to assume that an employer has a tax, while that represents a pretty good target, when you look at what I call sort of the three-legged stool of private exchanges, which is consumer-driven health plans, defined contribution, and on a third tier, a self-insured versus fully insured model. Those are three strong cost-value propositions that a private exchange can deliver. Yeah. And I think sorting that out certainly impacts the sales cycle.
Right. Talk about the your report and the vendors a little bit. Where do you see some of the competitive dynamics kind of shaping up?
Well, I think it's a very interesting landscape, right? And I think the key theme for me, and so my corporate expertise, I was in software product development as well. And when I look at the technology that these vendors are building, it's really of value in its current form or in some future forms, right? So it's highly valued asset. And so when I look at the competitive dynamics, obviously we have some M&A going on, right? And that's just the reflection of two things. That is a highly valued asset to either bolt onto a legacy platform or do some other things with the flexibility that these platforms have. But I think in the second set, part of the competitive dynamics is a lot of these vendors, are still third party, and I think you really need that in this market to continue to further the innovation, whatever that innovation may be. It could be enhancements on current capabilities, but it could be pushing this thing out further. So when I look at the competitive dynamics from the vendor perspective, I think there's really kind of three things that I see, right? Continue to fine-tune that decision support and more broadly that consumer experience. I think you're seeing vendors really entrench as enrollments come in, as they get the analytics, making that however you term that consumer experience, but that's a key selection criteria for vendors, right? How easy is it for employees to use? I think the second point that I think the market is moving toward is more ancillary support. And so how are vendors differentiating themselves, if you will, not in the case of stocking their virtual shelves, with product. I think that's part of it, and I think we're seeing that. But I think it's also getting those platforms to support those products in a manner they do health. So how do you allow different designs, different product configurations? And I think we're starting to see some vendors differentiate themselves there. And I think the last one, and definitely last, I wouldn't say it's pragmatic as much as it's futuristic, but going back to what the potential of these platforms are, it's how do we start moving and getting to the four-legged stool for the employer, which is more on the utilization and the claim side, right? So everything that we're talking about, from defined contribution, CDH, the employer status, that's all front end, and that's really highly valued. But I think from an employer standpoint, now how do you take this technology, or do you take this technology and start bridging it over to utilization and looking at some of the tools out there that have been out there outside of the employee benefit world, such as price transparency, or even one that's in the world of health and wellness. But how do we start bridging that, and now you're giving an employer sort of the full picture?
Yep. Yeah, I agree with you. How do you see, kind of switching a little bit, but very important, how do you see the sales distribution channels emerging and potentially changing, and even the convergence of really some new players in the space that have connection with employers right now?
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of the market, right? in a certain sense, it is Wild West, and I think those new players, do add some level of not only competitive dynamic but innovation. But if I go back to what the sales channel is, we can say what it is, but it's a cultural and it's a sales process shift for brokers. And I think certainly as we look on the higher end of the market, where this private exchange market started, I think the benefit consultants, the large market brokers, I think there's a pretty strong entrenchment and continued enhancement of where they fit in the market and how they're competing. As I look at growth and really opportunity and sort of the next tier of sales, it's really in that middle market, right? And I think what we're seeing is you have a lot of vendors that play in the large market space that also play in middle market are really reaching out and consistently communicating to brokers what the opportunities are, whether that's new products, whether that's delivering automation. And I think ultimately where we'll start to get next year is what we'll see is that the value proposition in that middle market, which is also a very fertile ground, is a little bit different than what we see in the higher end of the market, right? So I think once brokers sort of embrace and understand what that is, we're going to continue to see more companies either kind of devote or enter into the middle market, but we're going to see more middle market brokers join in as well.
Yeah, and I think it's a natural maturation of this market to see brokers moving more towards this model as they begin to understand it more and talk to their clients about it. And I agree. I mean, I talk a lot about the middle market's going to be the fastest moving market because it just makes sense. A lot of the elements of what a private exchange, can provide an employer, from a cost saving to an administrative saving to choice plans for the consumers, just makes sense for that middle market. They don't have the deep resources that a large employer has. Agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it great, right? And I think the other sort of dynamic here is you're not necessarily selling against the Cadillac Tax, right? So this is just pure sales on those value props that you've talked about. And I think from a broker standpoint, there is some comfort in that, but I think also, that's not that doesn't mean it's a slam dunk, because when you don't have that pressure, right? You're kind of digging your heels in and working the relationship. But I think it works both ways. But ultimately, I think that's really the boon here.
Yeah. When your number 2020 is around 20 million, right? Is that what you said earlier?
About just under 25.
Right. So that's down a little bit from what some of the earlier projections have been, when they claimed, by 2018, 40 million. But when you compare it to how long it took us to get HSA penetration of around 15 million, it's pretty rapid growth. So
it is, and I do an annual study in that area as well. And I think you draw the parallels, but then you also have to kind of put this on by itself and say what is the uptake. And I think it kind of goes back to the discussion we just had. I think it's the maturation of that middle market, because I think the largest employers, that's a long sales cycle, and certainly we'll see more of them join. But I think when you look at sort of kind of mass movement, getting that sales channel ready, because again, the technology works. I think you're seeing a lot of not only health, but the ancillary worksite and the other kind of carriers, actively playing. So I think you have the model ready. Now it's just the maturation of that sales channel.
Hey, Michael, would you go ahead, Michael? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
But would you agree or disagree with this? I mean, a lot of people talk about exchanges being a catalyst for consumerism. I talk a lot about consumerism being a catalyst for exchanges. In other words, if consumerism had not moved itself from the back road to the main street, which it has, and you look across the landscape on what employers and their brokers, advisors are doing and putting full replacement programs in place, consumers programs in place, would we be projecting exchanges to grow so rapidly? So I look at consumerism kind of driving exchanges as much as exchanges may be driving consumerism.
I think that's a great question. So I would tend to agree with you, and the reason I do is I think when you look at consumerism, in my mind, it kind of started from the back end, right? It started on the claim.
Yep.
And so now what we have is we're kind of moving upstream. So now when we think about the consumerism, it's not only, so we've sort of created that awareness in terms of how to use the benefits. So the natural extension is how do we create that awareness in terms of selecting that benefit and tying that to utilization?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Hey, we got a couple minutes to go here, and we kind of walked around it, and I want to give you a chance to give your perspective on it. Where do you see the growth being driven across kind of the product spectrum? You allude a little. Everyone talks about ancillary and where that's going to grow. People talk about telehealth. What do you see happening, and who's going to benefit the most from the emergence of the exchange penetration out in the market?
Well, and again, I think the conference did a great job of providing perspective here. So I'm not, for those that went to the conference, I'm not rehashing. But when I look at it, and obviously writing this report prior to that conference, to me, I think it's really the evolution of private exchanges becoming bigger than health, right? And so when I say, obviously health is driving people to the marketplace and selecting that benefit. But when I really look at it and say what companies stand to benefit, I think dental. Your consumer-driven health account companies, right, that value chain, and then you have the gap coverage, because what we are talking about for the most part, and it's not, I don't put a blanket over it, but we are talking probably lower premium, narrow network, high deductibles. So now you have your gap coverage, your critical illness, your terminal illness, or term life, excuse me. So when I look at it, right, what companies stand to benefit? It's ancillary, worksite, CDH participants, and they're going to ride this wave. But I think it goes back to our earlier conversation. I think the platforms are doing this now, but how do you sort of accommodate those products, and how do you incorporate that into the experience and effectively allow employees to kind of enroll during the process versus having to kind of enroll and then wait and do some other things. So I think that's the natural evolution of exchanges, but I think those companies, just due to visibility, access, distribution, however you want to term it, those companies really stand to benefit from private exchanges. It's new distribution.
Yeah, I think it's going to eventually tie in the retirement side too. Agree? I mean, look at what MassMutual is about to do with their integrated benefit platform.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the sky's the limit, right? I think then it just becomes how do you just integrate that in a meaningful way.
I mean, if we reach the end goal, this will become the 365, 24/7 benefit portal for employees and employers to provide access to their employees. Correct?
That's the way I see it, right? And I think there's different models to there, but I think there's enough there from it's no longer an enrollment platform only, right? I think it's more on the management side, and I think I'm right there with you. So there's a reason and there's value for employees to continually coming back to that portal. So it does become sort of an Uber employee benefit management portal.
Michael, it's been great having you on the program today, and to our audience right now, before I let Michael kind of tie it up, I mean, Michael will be with us at Private Exchange Forum, and Michael, I really appreciate your involvement with us at our events and in other ways. I'd like to give you a chance to kind of leave our audience with a few takeaways, if you would, please.
Sure. I think don't get frustrated, right? I mean, I think going back to the original point, adoption hasn't been as what I think companies have anticipated, but the model's in place, the technology works, and we are ready for liftoff. And particularly as we think about next, kind of coming into the 2016 enrollment. I think for the brokers out there, you guys are the key to success, right? As the underlying technology works, product companies are actively supplying products. I think you really have the opportunity to kind of move this market and shape this market going forward. So, certainly anticipate that happening. And I think the last one is I think we're not only on the broker side, but we're going to see, this value chain expand vertically. We touched on it very briefly. There are some new entrants, but I think not only from that perspective, but, within the worksite and ancillary, we're going to start seeing more and more companies jumping in.
Yeah, I agree. Michael, thank you so much. Enjoy your weekend up there, and we'll see you and talk to you real soon. Take care.
Fantastic. Cheers, guys.